Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, awesome. Do we have a pointer? Or I might not need it, but anyway, thank you so much. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for that introduction. And yeah, I've had a very varied career path. I've worked in the nonprofit sector. I've worked now at a conservation, like a policy conservation think tank, academia, philanthropy. So I'd be happy to talk to anybody who's interested about any of those sort of angles on this kind of work. But today I want to talk to you a bit about my work in the Amazon. I'm hearing some feedback about my work in the Amazon. And as was mentioned, I am working very closely with the Instituto de Pesquisa Ambiental da Amazônia, IPAM. This is an NGO based in Brazil that has worked very closely with Woodwell in its 30 years since it was founded. And a lot of the work I'm going to present today really is a product of that partnership. And they're really kind of tapped into the policy scene there as well. So it's really one of the main ways that we can communicate the science that we do to decision makers on the ground. And the work I'm going to present today is by no means only mine. It's a very collaborative, interdisciplinary kind of body of work, and I'm going to try to point out, some of those partnerships. But I just want to point out that this is, when I say we, I mean like a very large royal we, many people, many students, postdocs, and collaborators involved, both in the U.S. and in Brazil. How do I go forward? Help. I think it's okay there.
Yep.
All right, thanks. Okay, so for those of you who don't know Woodwell, we are based in Cape Cod, so just a couple hours down the road over the bridge in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. We were founded as the Woods Hole Research Center and just changed our name about 3 years ago. So some of you might have heard of us in our former iteration. The reason we changed our name was, one, to give a hint about what kind of research we do, right? Woods Hole Research Center doesn't really say much about what kind of research, just where. And then Woodwell was after our founder, George Woodwell, who is an amazing ecologist who's had a very long career working on some of the biggest environmental issues of his day. He worked on DDT back when we didn't understand the impacts that was having on the environment. And once we did, kind of making sure that it got banned. He was one of the first people to testify to the US Congress about the dangers of runaway climate change back in the early 80s. Spoiler alert, they didn't leap into action. And so we're still kind of sounding the alarm today. And we're organized today in the last 4 years, we've kind of organized into these program areas. You can see there it's kind of a mix of geographies. So we have a big Arctic program and a tropics program, which is where a lot of the Amazon work sits. And then we have these themes, right? Water, climate risk, and carbon. And you can imagine there's a lot of crossover across these programs, but it's kind of a way to organize our work and explain it through different lenses. I am the director of the water program, but I do a lot of work in the tropics program. And the questions that I'm interested in are really kind of at the interface of climate change, agricultural production, and kind of the limits on agricultural systems and what keeps forest ecosystems functioning. And so kind of big picture questions about, what are the climatic limits on agricultural production and forests, and how can we reconcile the need to produce food for a growing human population and the need to kind of keep enough forest standing so that all of those ecosystem services that we depend on continue to exist. But my interest in the Amazon has very personal roots. I am Brazilian American. I grew up, my grandparents on my dad's side are from Belém, which is at the mouth of the Amazon. And my grandmother was this amazing storyteller. And I kind of grew up hearing a lot about just the folklore from the Amazon. Every time I had a sore throat or a bumped knee, she wanted to treat it with copaíba oil or andiroba oil, eating cupuaçu and acai. So I had this, from a very young age, idea of the cultural and biological richness of the Amazon. And when I was able to go as a child, I was 12, I think, the first time I went, I was really taken with it. And I really wanted to have an excuse, a career that would allow me to spend time in this forest. And I found that in college through primatology. I got really interested in tropical ecology. I thought I wanted to study monkeys because you can follow them around in these beautiful places, understand how they interact with the environment. I had a great time doing field work. But the more time I spent in these remote tropical landscapes, the more I became aware of all of the pressures on those forest ecosystems. And I started to become a little bit more interested in, okay, well, how do we keep enough habitat around so that these monkeys can be around, so that so I started to see these bigger picture questions. And it was around the time that these satellite time series, Landsat satellite time series became freely available for the first time. And I started to realize how global forces, global markets could kind of reach into these really remote areas and completely change the landscape. So this is Tamaulipas, Peru, a pretty remote area of the Peruvian Amazon. And this is gold mining. So small scale gold mining responding to the change in the price of gold around 2010. Here's another example from Bolivia. This is, you can see, these are, those little nuclei are Mennonite communities in the Bolivian Amazon responding to soybean prices and, sort of intensifying soybean production for export. And again, you can see just like dramatic landscapes, changes in these landscapes over a very short time scale. And I started to become really interested in, how is it that you can have an individual sitting in this pretty remote landscape, making a decision that they think is rational, and responding to kind of a signal that makes sense to them. And if you repeat that 10, 100, 1,000 times, it leads to a scale of change that is not really in anybody's interest over the long term. And so I started thinking kind of globally about tropical forests and how important they were, and what we can do to kind of make some of those connections visible so that we can maybe make some better decisions for the long term. So this is a map of tropical forests that I love. It's we kind of call it forests as mountains. So everything that looks like a mountain is an area that has high above ground forest carbon. Tropical forests, you can see, have the most carbon on the planet. They have about 400 petagrams of carbon total. Half of that is an above ground forest carbon, which is pretty vulnerable to deforestation, degradation, various types of disturbance. And half of that, so about 100 petagrams, is in the Amazon. So the Amazon is a really globally important place. It's not an accident that all of that biomass and productivity happens along the equator. That's an area where we've had a stable climate with basically unlimited sunlight, unlimited rainfall for a very long time. And so that leads to high biological productivity. But it's not just about carbon. As director of the water program, I have to say that the water cycle is a really important part of why we want to keep these ecosystems functioning. This is another video that I love. It's not clouds, it's actually water vapor circulating around the planet. And you can see almost kind of this pulsing, like this heartbeat at the Amazon, right? That's forest evapotranspiring water. So you have humid air coming in across the Atlantic, onto the South American continent. Rain falls down on the forests, and they evapotranspire that water back up to the atmosphere, and you have this cycle that continues until that water vapor hits the Andes and does a U-turn and goes back across the continent. And those atmospheric rivers, as they're called, actually irrigate rain-fed agriculture hundreds of kilometers downwind. They provide water for some of South America's largest cities. So a really important function of the forests that we want to maintain. So one of the kind of big picture questions that I think about, I and my colleagues, is how are those agricultural expansion and agricultural intensification reshaping these tropical watersheds at various scales. Here's a map of the Amazon. It is huge. It is about the size of the continental US. And about 20% of that area has already been cleared, so that's the area in yellow. But 80% of the forest is still standing in some form of functionality. I'll draw your attention to the blue. That's about 1 million square kilometers of rivers and wetland ecosystems that are also an incredibly important part of the system. And that red triangle you see in the southeastern kind of corner of the Amazon looks tiny. That is the research station that EPAM has been running. It's actually a private soybean farm where the landowner has allowed EPAM to have a presence for it'll be 20 years next year. And it looks tiny in the context of the Amazon, but it's about 800 square kilometers, which is huge for a single farm. That's the size of all of Cape Cod. on a single farm. About half of it is in forests, and a third of it is in soybean production, and 2/3 of it is in forests. And so it's a really great laboratory to understand these land use changes as they happen. And to give you a sense of kind of the land use history, back in the 80s, we start seeing clearing in the region for mostly cattle ranching. That cattle ranching is some for beef production for local consumption. It's also kind of tied up in land speculation and land grabbing in complicated ways, right? It's a way that people show they're using the land and they hope to get title to it. There's that. And then eventually you see, like in the early 2000s, you see those cattle ranches being consolidated into highly mechanized production of soybeans for global markets, eventually double cropping of soybeans and maize and cotton as well. And so you see these really rapid changes in response to market signals. Here's a zoom in of Tanguro, again, that red triangle. The watershed outline there, that's the upper Xingu Basin. It's the headwaters of the easternmost tributary of the Amazon. The area in brown in the center is the Xingu Indigenous Territory. That's the very first indigenous territory that was recognized in Brazil back in 1961. And since then, there have been millions of hectares that have been recognized. About 50% of the Amazon is now protected in either a strict protected area, a park, or an indigenous territory. So a really kind of interesting contrast, and we have a lot of work, as you'll see, that kind of compares and contrasts what's happening outside versus inside the reserve. So it's been a really important laboratory for us to understand the changes that are happening in these landscapes. Here's an aerial view just to give you a sense of what these farms look like. They're huge in scale, right? You have these massive areas in this is a fallow crop, but that are implanted, and then they're kind of bisected by these rivers with riparian forests along the corridors. I'll draw your attention to that reservoir right in the middle there. I'll come back to that, but it's another feature of the landscape that I've been studying quite a lot. So we're really trying to understand how the change from forest to agriculture is changing the way water flows through these systems, right? If you have a set amount of rainfall, you're changing how the water infiltrates into the soil, how much runs off into the streams, how much is exported downstream, how much is taken up by the crops. So all of these things, all these pieces of the water cycle are changing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. We use a variety of methods. So this is kind of a way of directly measuring the amount of water in the soil using what's called resistivity. So you take a probe, and in this case, we did a transect from the soybean field into the forest. You take a probe and put it on one end and on the other, and then you run electrical current. And where you have more conductance, you have more water. And through a series of modeling steps that I won't get into, you can get to a map, basically, of how much water you have at depth. And right away, you can see that there's way more water underneath the soybeans than in the forests, which is not surprising because the forests have roots that go all the way down to 8, 9, 10 meters, and they're using up a lot of that soil water, especially during the dry season. They're kind of pumping that water up, sucking it from very deep layers towards the end of the dry season and pumping it back up to the atmosphere, that evapotranspiration that I talked about before. We've been monitoring watersheds. This is one of the really cool things about working in a place for 20 years. We have long-term studies looking at how watersheds that are 100% in forest compared to watersheds that are almost 100% in agriculture. So we can actually measure the stream flow, the water quality, what's happening with the fish communities, all of these different aspects of these watersheds. And this is work that Chris Neal, my colleague at the Marine Biological Laboratory, Linda Deegan, and several others have been really spearheading. And getting back to those reservoirs, right? What's happening along those rivers? Brazil has legislation that actually protects riparian forests, which is really cool. I mean, it's like unlike anything we have here or even in Europe. Those forests along streams are supposed to be protected, and where they've been cleared, as in this case, they're supposed to be restored by law. And now there's ways that landowners, loans for landowners are kind of tied to showing that they're making strides and doing some of that restoration. But you see that there's definitely some features, you know, in some places you don't actually have that much riparian forest protection, and you have these reservoirs that are like, you know, beginning at the headwater of a small stream, go down 500 more meters, another one. And so when I started working in this landscape, I was like, what about these reservoirs? Like, how are they installed? Are they regulated? How many are there? And I just kind of followed that curiosity, because again, there were satellite images now available that would allow me to kind of look at that question. We found that at Changuro, there were about 56 when I started working there. And then we decided to look at the Xingu, and there were 10,000 in the Xingu Basin alone. So one for every 7 kilometers of stream length, which is a lot. And these are not like big dams, which, you know, you have to do an environmental impact assessment and, you know, show that it, you know, you're going to manage the flows to minimize impact and so forth. These are things, again, local decisions that just get repeated again and again, and then you end up with a situation where you've got 10,000 reservoirs. These reservoirs, you can imagine, are much hotter than a shaded stream that's like going through forest. They are also a potential source of methane production, and one that has not been accounted for in global carbon cycles. And so this is just to give you a sense of what they look like. They're not big dams. They're kind of the size of beaver dams. They kind of form these man-made wetlands. So a lot of algal production, macrophyte production. We see otters, fish, birds, you know, they're very kind of nice in some ways, but they also create these low oxygen conditions that are perfect for methane production. Methane is something that is biologically, if you have access to oxygen, you're not gonna take that pathway, because it takes a lot more energy to produce methane. But if you don't have access to oxygen, you're kind of forced in that direction as a bacteria or a microbe. So don't worry about the details of this, but just to say that, you know, most of the methane production happens in the sediments in these low oxygen environments. And we basically, I got a grant out of this curiosity, right? There's 10,000 reservoirs. Are they producing enough methane to make a difference in the global carbon budget? Let's measure it. And so there are 3 pathways that we measured. The bubbles that come up directly from the sediment, they're like super high in methane, like high enough that, you know, if you were to light a match, they would light. And then you have diffusion across the water-air interface, and you have just mixing at the outlet. So at the outflow, where you have mixing, methane isn't very stably dissolved in water. So if you have any kind of turbulence, it gets emitted to the atmosphere. So we measured those 3. And we did it in 6 reservoirs, kind of small, medium, and large. Those pink dots are permanent sampling locations, and we'd go back every month and set up our very high-tech setup here. So these chambers were kind of homemade. We took water jugs, flipped them upside down, cut them, you know, put a valve on top that we could sample from, floated them with pool noodles, and would put them out for 24 hours and kind of measure the change in methane. And then for the bubbles, we have these inverted funnel traps. Again, it's the kind of funnel that you would change the oil in your car back when cars had oil. They still do, but and again, floated with the pool noodle. And you can sample, you can kind of get a sense of the volume of bubbles that were trapped, and you can sample off the top and understand how much CO2 versus methane is in those bubbles. So pretty fun, low-tech solution to measuring this stuff. We bring back the gas samples, and we just run them on the gas chromatograph at Woodwell. And here's a graph that shows some of the early results. These are ordered from small to large. So the gray bars are the rainy season. So over a whole year, right? So it's the rainy season in each of the reservoirs. And you can see that the smaller reservoirs had higher diffusive fluxes across the water-air interface, and that in the rainy season, we see higher fluxes. That makes sense. There's a lot of change in atmospheric pressure and a lot more mixing of the water in those reservoirs, and so it's easier for them to kind of diffuse out. We also see some interesting differences in what the most important pathway is in a small versus a large reservoir. So that degassing at the outlet is really important for the small reservoirs. And then for the large reservoirs, the bubble fluxes are kind of the biggest part of the emissions. So still trying to scale that up to the whole landscape. I have a student at CU Boulder, Kylan Solvik, who's working on that as part of his PhD dissertation. He's been using machine learning. Now we've got better data sets to look at this over large scales, and also more sophisticated ways to kind of pick these out without having to kind of, I don't know, do so much like hand manipulation of the images as I had to do. And so we're finding that there's something like 650,000 of these across all of South America. So potentially a really big source. And we're working on, figuring out, how important that is to the whole carbon budget. Oops, wrong way. Oops. No, that was the right way. Sorry. So one of the cool things about having spatial data is we can also look at, does it change from the inlet to the outlet? What are the changes spatially in the methane concentrations? So yellow is higher concentrations, and you can see that the small reservoirs in the dry season, this is average for the dry season, have much more hot surface water methane concentrations than the big ones. Not much going on in the big ones in the dry season, but then they light up in the wet season. So again, because they're deep, we think they're just stratified, right? That methane gets trapped at the bottom and it doesn't diffuse out to the surface in the dry season, but in the wet season, you get more mixing and it does come out at the surface. So all of that sort of connects to this idea of climate feedbacks of these big land use changes, right? One way is directly through greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, which can affect climate. But we also have some more direct impacts of these land use changes on local and regional climate. So this is a very dramatic, but also very common edge in these landscapes, right? And anybody who's gone for a hike in the forest and walked out into like a parking lot or an open area can kind of imagine the difference in microclimate from inside that forest to that field, right? It's a lot hotter in the field than it is in the forest. And that's partly because of shading, but also because of the energy and water balance. And so we've also been working on kind of quantifying that. And so just to give you a sense of what that looks like, here's a schematic of a forest. And if you have kind of a set amount of rainfall and incoming solar radiation, about 3/4 of that rainfall is going to get returned back to the atmosphere via ET, evapotranspiration. The rest is going to go out in the stream. When you take away those deep-rooted forests and you replace them with very shallow-rooted soybeans or maize, which are only on the landscape for about 3-4 months of the year, you basically reduce the evapotranspiration term by about 1/3. And you increase the amount of water that's exported in the streams. So it's a pretty fundamental difference in how the landscape is functioning if you think about the scale of change that's happening. You can see those changes from space. So this is a map that shows deforestation on the left. In the middle, it's a land surface temperature. This is from the sensor, the MODIS sensor on the Terra and Aqua satellites. About 5 degrees Celsius hotter in those deforested areas than it is in the forested areas, so 10 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a pretty big difference. If we're thinking about, not having average global temperatures go over 1.5 degrees Celsius, removing the forest increases it locally by 5 degrees Celsius, right? And it only makes matters worse. 30% less evapotranspiration, again, from a product from the MODIS satellite. And this is a paper that Dr. Mike Coe, who's the director of our tropics program at Woodwell, has in review now. This is kind of a complicated graph, but I'll walk you through it. And the point is that we can actually quantify the difference in each specific land use transition on each of those energy balance terms. So here on the x-axis, 0 is 100% forest cover, so no change. 1 is 0% forest cover, 100% agriculture. And we have these very clean relationships between, the proportion of agriculture in a pixel and the amount of any one of the energy balance terms. So let's focus on land surface temperature. We know that it will change when you switch from forest to pasture. If you are 100% forested, you'll be 1 temperature. If you're 100% pasture, you'll be 4 degrees Celsius warmer. That looks a little bit different for cropland, it's about 6 degrees Celsius. And so like you have a unique fingerprint of each of these land use transitions on each of the water and energy balance terms. And that means that you can look at the average change in the landscape, but you can also say, the soybean market is having this effect on the amount of water that is being recycled, and the cattle ranching sector is having this effect, and so forth, which is a really interesting, that attribution is a really interesting piece that hadn't been done before in quite this way. Another student, Ariane Rodriguez, did the same thing for the savanna next door. And the savanna is not as protected through policy, and also just through I guess there's just kind of a social bias against savannas relative to tropical forests, the Cerrado in particular. And it's an incredibly important landscape. It has a high degree of endemism, is incredibly threatened. Over half of it has already been cleared, and all of the agricultural pressure as we try to keep people from deforesting the Amazon is getting pushed into the savanna. So her work showed that you have similar impacts, even though it's not as high biomass, similar impacts on evapotranspiration, land surface temperature. And if you look across the landscape, with the recent changes that have happened, that area that's outlined in kind of bold is the Mato Piba region, which is an area where the government has really been pushing agricultural expansion, and where we've seen just very rapid land use changes, large-scale soybean plantations, large-scale deforestation or clearing of the Cerrado. And we see big hotspots of evapotranspiration loss and land surface temperature increase. Now, this is really concerning because there's a gradient of climate here. It's an extremely dry region. This is close to the forest, and it's pretty moist and kind of a transition from the savanna to the forest. Up there is a transition to a scrub dryland ecosystem. It's extremely dry. It gets about 500 millimeters of rainfall a year, and we're pushing it to an even drier state, which means that it's becoming harder and harder to produce there. And sure enough, that's where we see irrigation being brought in at large scale, and we're starting to see water conflicts like we see in areas of the Southwest, right? And so we're kind of pushing agriculture to an area where it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense in terms of what the ecosystem can sustain, and we're making it worse through those land use changes. Here's another way to look at the same thing, right? So this is Ludmila Hatchis. She's another scientist in our tropics program, Brazilian as well. So you can think of this graph as a climate space. On the x-axis, you have rainfall. Sorry, the y-axis, you have rainfall. On the x-axis, you have an index of dryness or drought intensity. So red is dry and low rainfall. Green is moist, humid, and high rainfall. Those black dots are everywhere that agriculture exists today, like 5 years ago. And that polygon is think of it as the ideal climate space for agriculture, right? Farmers plant where they know it makes sense to plant. Now we're going to go forward into the future. So this is observed climate from 1970 to 1979. And we're moving forward in climate space. The crops are staying in the same place. So going into the future, and this is not even a most extreme climate scenario, all of the croplands are moving into a drier and a less rainfall climate space. So there's more and more stress precisely in that region that I was pointing out before that's already pretty dry, right? There's more and more stress on these agricultural systems. So that's a concerning feature, but also an important thing to know and to think about when you're thinking about agricultural policy and how to climate proof and future proof these investments into the future. So, okay. Now getting to fire, which is the other thing that, you can imagine a drier landscape with less rainfall. Fire, as we're seeing around the world, is becoming more and more common, right? And in the Amazon, unlike in places like California, or even in the savanna that I mentioned before, fire is not a natural part of the system. There are no natural ignition sources like lightning. These forests, I think, best guess, they might have had a fire return interval like every 500 years, like during a very extreme drought. But otherwise, you might even catch fire, but as soon as you kind of hit the dew point at night, the fire would go out. And now we're seeing that this is changing because of these climate feedbacks that I've been mentioning. It was raised before, kind of the boundary between tropical forests and savanna ecosystems, right? It is also defined in the climate space. So this is the same concept. Y-axis is rainfall, x-axis is an index of dryness. And you can see that these ecosystems, the Amazon, which is a humid tropical forest, the Cerrado, which is kind of a dry savanna ecosystem, and the Caatinga, which is a scrub, like very dry scrub, almost like deserty ecosystem, dryland ecosystem, they fall out really nicely in climate space. Climate actually defines the carrying capacity and the ecosystem that exists in that space. Now, if I were to, draw an arrow in each of those dots into the future, it would go from the left to the right, my left to my right. So even in areas where you're not having lower rainfall, you are getting drier, which means that you need more water to support those trees. You need more water to support those crops if they're croplands. And what that does is it creates instability in the system, right? You have kind of a system that is very vulnerable to disturbances and can go either towards an unhealthy kind of like sequentially degraded system or towards a more healthy region if we manage to manage those disturbances and kind of help forests recover. And to me today, the most important factor in which way that ball rolls is fire. If we can manage fire in these ecosystems, we can buy time to do something about the climate crisis. If we can't, they will very quickly move to a lower biomass state because the effects of fire are pretty intense. Unfortunately, we are changing all three of the main drivers of fire activity. We're changing climate, which we've already talked about. We're changing fuel sources because we are deforesting, which creates basically a bonfire that's, ready to be lit and is purposely lit to remove the biomass from that area. And that changes the ignition source. And it changes climate, which we've already talked about, right? So those three things are really kind of contributing to this change in the fire regime. And I would say that dealing with deforestation and dealing with forest degradation, fire in particular, is going to be the most important factor in ensuring the resiliency of these forests for the near term. I should point out that Sane Kruid, I'm pronouncing her name wrong. It was a policy student here at Tufts, and she did an internship with us at Woodwell. And this is from a policy brief, which turned into a paper that we did together. And, back to the ignition, like it's hard for these forests to burn. They won't burn unless a person, lights a fire that can escape into a forest when conditions are appropriate. My colleagues who work in wildland fires think a lot about the wildland urban interface, because, where fires start and how they escape into these ecosystems. And in these systems, really the wildland agricultural interface is important because all of those ignition sources are happening where people are. They're happening on farms, they're happening along roads, along rivers. And that's where we really need to think about prevention and suppression to keep forests from burning. How am I doing on time? Okay, thank you. So one of the really cool things about being at Tanguro is that we can actually do experimental work to understand kind of the limits of like what makes these forests flammable, when do they kind of flip into a lower biomass system, whatever. So we were able to do a fire experiment where we actually burned 50 hectares of forests on 1-year intervals, on 3-year intervals, and then we had a control where we looked at, what happened in each case. And I won't get into the details, but basically the upshot is this: it took 2 fires and 1 big drought to flip the system from a forest into this very degraded ecosystem that you see here. And those compounding disturbances are really the issue, right? It's not just how many times you burn or if you burn, but a fire during an extreme drought year like we're having today can have devastating consequences. And so really thinking about how those disturbances layer on each other and what the impacts are for forests is kind of the name of the game in managing these systems. And there's some glimmers of hope about how these ecosystems put themselves back together as well. Those forests actually recovered. We've been following the recovery over the last 10 years, and they actually recovered evapotranspiration and some other ecosystem services very quickly. And we're watching how they kind of put themselves back together. One of the surprising heroes of this story is the tapir, the lowland tapir, which we kind of just being in these burn plots realized that they were preferentially using the more open areas. They move over very large regions. They don't care at all about walking through a soybean field. They're the last large-bodied herbivores that kind of eat seeds of all, like 100 species, I think we found. We had a poor master student who actually went to the latrines and like collected the feces, picked out the seeds, identified the species, found out that they actually were viable. 90% of them were viable. So they're gardeners. They're like moving seeds around the landscapes to these degraded areas, delivering them in these nice little fertilizer packets that then go on to create seedlings. And so understanding those dynamics is also an important part of being in this landscape and thinking about how we can facilitate natural ecosystem process recovery. I also really appreciate being able to take those experimental results and think at a broader scale about what's happening in the Xingu territory, for example, and in the broader Amazon. So the Xingu remembers that large indigenous territory just upstream from Tenguru. This is, again, Divino Silverio, who is now a professor at the Federal Rural University of Amazonia. And he showed, he actually partnered with indigenous researchers inside the reserve to think about and characterize how fire regimes are changing inside the reserve. And this is, for me, this graph is really a testament to how quickly things have changed, right? I started working in this region here. At that point, those forests never burned. Fast forward to 2005, and you start seeing every time there's a major drought, there's a big peak in fire. Every time there's a drought, the forests burn. And nothing's changed about the way indigenous people, for example, are using fire. They've been using fire the same way for millennia, but now they're escaping and like running out of control. And so we found that about 15% of the forests have been burned multiple times. And there's been forest loss in the reserve. And we've been working together with federal agencies and the indigenous people in the reserve to think about, okay, how do we manage this new reality? Because obviously, we know when a drought is coming, building up in the landscape, and what can we do to mitigate and to provide assistance when fires get out of control. That has led to, so this is an image of the just the smoke in the reserve in September 2022, which was a bad fire year. And it's led to some interesting partnerships that have been really productive. So this is a photo from the International Wildland Conference, which was in Portugal last year. We were able to send a couple of indigenous people from the Xingu to participate in that conference, and they're standing there with somebody from Previfogo, which is the agency for fire prevention in Brazil, and just some really interesting work in exchanging different knowledge systems and different relationships to the landscape, but trying to figure out how to cope with this new reality in a productive way. So that has been a really gratifying part of this work. And something that has evolved kind of almost organically as we've done this work together. I think I might stop there and take questions because I feel like I've gone on a little long, but I have a couple of slides that I can use to kind of supplement. What do you?
15 minutes for Q&A if we want to do a couple minutes just to wrap up.
Sure.
I think we're okay.
Okay, sounds good. Well, okay. This is, I think, maybe a more hopeful part of the talk. So I'll just kind of go through really quickly some of the, again, these partnerships that have evolved as things have changed, right? And trying to think about solutions in a changing landscape. One of the things that we've been working on is really taking the climate science, as we did with, as you saw in those agriculture, kind of like looking at agricultural production areas going forward into a changing climate, thinking about, okay, how can we take that climate information 3, 4, 5 months before the fire season and cross it with areas of recent deforestation that we know are likely to be ignition sources, and put out early warning alerts of areas where we expect there to be a lot of fire, to allow for preparedness, for funding, for, you know, for putting people in the right place in the landscape to try to like stop some of these big fires. Another big thing that has changed the game in the last couple of years, this is Doug Morton, who was a PhD student with me and is now a scientist at NASA. And his group has actually put out this new map. You can look at, new dashboard. You can look online on any given day and know exactly how many fires are burning, and not just that, know what kind of fires they are. Are they purposeful pasture management fires, or are they escape fires into forests? So I don't know if you remember back in 2019, it was like there was a huge fire year. It seemed like the entire Amazon was burning, but in reality, some of those fires were on purpose. They were deforestation fires. Some of them were just people clearing their pastures, and some of those were escaped into forests. And each of those has a different management strategy associated with it. And so knowing that difference is super important for planning, for fire suppression, et cetera. We've been working with firefighters, both indigenous firefighters and state firefighters. This is Ani Alankar and my postdoc, Manuela Machado, who's been doing a lot of work with the firefighters to understand, okay, how do you use the spatial data? What do you need to get in order to make an informed decision about how to fight a fire? Because we were finding that they were downloading raw data and trying to figure out, you know, they have wind on their phone, raw data on fire, active fires from somewhere else. They were like managing 5 different data streams, kind of integrating them in their heads, and then saying, you know, calling somebody on the phone and being like, you go here, oh, that road's out. You know, they're trying to like manage complex logistics. And we realized there was a lot of room to streamline that data flow, right? To just deliver, okay, like the information that they needed to know. Here's the fire line, here's where the wind's coming from, whatever they need. And so we've been working with them to automate some of that stuff in these dashboards, like Google Earth Engine dashboards, where they can kind of look in real time and understand the scenario and act very quickly. We've been also, you know, we realized that there's no information at all. There hadn't been before this project that the Moore Foundation funded actually on air quality in the Amazon. So we know in big cities when the air quality is bad and when we shouldn't go outside, but in these rural areas where smoke was just sitting over the landscape, as you saw in that photo a couple of slides ago, we had no information. And so we've been deploying these sensors just to get that information out there and to kind of try to like motivate policy action, but also, you know, inform both firefighters and rural populations about air quality. And again, working with indigenous people to try to connect different modes of knowing and bring them to places like the UN Climate Convention, and you know, these fire conferences, et cetera. And so this is just one example of that kind of work. It was an op-ed that I wrote with Valeria Pae Kashiwana about the changing fire dynamics and the need for indigenous people to have not only a seat at the table, but to actually lead what is happening in these landscapes. And so yeah, I guess I'll just end with the thought that it really does take multiple perspectives, multiple, you know, ways of knowing to arrive at these potential solutions in a perpetually kind of changing landscape. And so I'll stop there. Thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Macedo. Thank you for bringing us those last few slides. I think it was really nice to see some of the efforts going forward. I'm happy to bring the mic to you if you have a question.
I'm Alexandra Thorne. I teach GIS classes here, and I like love seeing all these maps. I'm curious, like, of these data sets, are these things that say tough students could download and like use in their own GIS software, or is this just on dashboards? What's the story with the data? I also had a second question about the political backdrop and the Bolsonaro administration and the transition into the Silva administration and what that's doing for the Amazon.
Yeah, a lot of these data sets are freely available. That dashboard, you can download the point data, and I can pass you the link if you didn't write it down. It's awesome. I'm not sure about the Google Earth Engine library that I showed you, but it will be freely available. I'm not sure if it's up yet. But yeah, definitely a lot of resources, and I'd be happy just to reach out if you want links to those. The Purple Air data, the air quality data is up on purpleair.com. It is freely available in real time. Not as easy to download the long-term data, but the Bolsonaro administration, it rolled back a lot of important advances in environmental legislation and monitoring enforcement. Right, we had deforestation levels at a historic low. I mean, historic like since the 1970s, right? Right up to when the Bolsonaro administration came in, and there was kind of a climate of permissiveness, and that I think emboldened a lot of people to deforest. And I think the pandemic didn't help, right? Because it made it really hard to do enforcement in a really effective way. But also a lot of the agencies that were charged with that were, limited funding, hostile kind of interaction with the government, et cetera. The Lula administration has made some strides to reverse that. I mean, we see deforestation has come down quite a lot. There's been, the agency FUNAI, the Agency for Indigenous Affairs, and another Indigenous agency were recreated almost immediately. The Ministry of Environment has a really strong leader in Marina Silva, and they added climate change to that agency's mandate, right? So it's the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. We see deforestation rates come way down, and yet we have an incredible drought in the Amazon this year. Fires are, pretty high despite the lower deforestation, and you can kind of see that there's a lag in the system, plus this compounding disturbance of an El Nino event that's setting up. We have river levels that are super low, and that's leading to a pretty intense fire season, and it's probably going to get worse in the next year. So, good news, bad news. It does take a while, I think, to undo some of the damage that's been done to the infrastructure around environmental legislation and enforcement. And I think it'll be a couple of years before we know exactly where that ends up. So,
hi, we have a question from online.
Oh yeah.
Ujayant is asking, to what extent do you see larger effects in areas closer to international borders? Do you see differences in forest policy between Brazil and neighboring nations?
Ooh. I think there's, that's a really good question. There are differences in forest policy. We do see, yes. I mean, I think that, things like streams and air quality and even kind of deforestation don't really recognize international borders, right? We see in some of those pretty remote regions where the borders are a lot of illegal activities that lead to deforestation, right? Illegal logging, narco trafficking, I think is a big issue along some of these borders. The map region, Madre de Dios, Acre, Pando, so Bolivia, Peru, Brazil is an area where we've seen a lot of migration, right? So there's an earthquake in Haiti. A lot of people ended up kind of going to South America, and you see kind of like large influxes of people just trying to like, you know, find a stable place to live. And they often come through these remote areas, and then, you know, it just creates, anytime you have kind of unplanned migration like that, it kind of, it sets up the potential for deforestation and all sorts of things as people just try to kind of, you know, make a living. Certainly the instability in Venezuela has led to, you know, millions of people. So just like, yeah, it's all connected. It's a very good question. I guess I'm not sure if I answered it, but yeah.
So the history of Woodwell's work in Brazil is really fascinating. And I think your presentation really showed us that you've got Brazilians working with North American scientists, and then you are coming back as a Brazilian of a, you know, first generation here.
First generation, yeah.
And so I wonder, as you go back, is it different for you than it is for someone who is not a first generation Brazilian working in Brazil? Because I work in Costa Rica, and I'm always very mindful that I'm not Costa Rican. And so I'm just kind of curious as to, so what has made Woodwell so effective over the years in terms of its ability to sort of keep this relationship going for years and years and years, and how has your own experience fed into that?
It's a great question. Yeah, I'm certainly very mindful that I'm, you know, based at a U.S. institution and kind of going back to Brazil, and I've had this kind of dual identity, grew up partly here, partly there. I mean, it's been very special for me to be able to work very closely with local students and to kind of, you know, create opportunities for them here, create this exchange that's been really rich. I mean, I didn't like point them out, but we work with a lot of students from the university that's just 3 hours away from Tanguru, and you know, they're people who grew up in the region. They like do research, they have these international opportunities, but they go back and they, you know, they set up their own labs, and like they are very committed to the region, and they're from there and they stay there, and it's been, that is amazing. And I think a really important part of the work that we do. I mean, I think Woodwell working in the region, I think we've only been kind of successful long-term because we have had long-term partnerships. I mean, we've been working with EPAM since they were created. It's been 30 years, and they lead a lot of the science, and we kind of support with you know, the skills that we have, and that exchange is very rich. But I think having a Brazilian institution run by Brazilians that, you know, is sitting in Brasilia, they're headquartered in Brasilia. They have kind of all the connections with government agencies, and they have the legitimacy to communicate the science and communicate with local people that we wouldn't as a North American institution. And so I think that that mutual respect and that long-term kind of investment in the region has been, I think, critical to our success there. So, yeah.
Thank you. Actually, that's I think a perfect way to the question I wanted to ask, which is, well, this is an impressive data set, and it's so unique because of the length in time and also the connections you have in place. So what is how do you translate this science into policy in the region? What kind of mechanisms or connections or maybe even success stories from taking the work of the scientists into new policies?
That is a very good question. I'm like, my mind just went in like 10 different directions. Well, I'll just give you one recent example, right? I think, well, two. I like early on thinking about deforestation, like deforestation dynamics, what's driving deforestation, and what the levers are to kind of change that, you know, like to the extent that, okay, the law protects 80% of forests on private property, and we know deforestation is happening in excess of that, like how, right? Some of it is collaborating with the Brazilian agencies who do the monitoring and enforcement. Some some of it is doing the science that actually says, okay, here's an area, and this is something that I worked on in my PhD, so it was kind of my first foray into this, was we could map the area that was deforested, and then now we have data sets we can look forward into time and see what it became. So we could say 20% of the deforestation is happening for soy production eventually, right? And a couple of years after. And, you know, we can actually kind of point to the specific actors who are driving that deforestation. And what that led to was then, you know, clarity around what the processes were, and an ability to go to European markets and say, hey, you're buying deforestation soy, right? And so like that, that was kind of a market-based policy, trying to create market incentives for producers to not deforest illegally, right? And then there's kind of the stick, right? The fine that arrived in their mailbox, because now we can see from space what's happening. That also has helped. In other, like more recently, forest degradation is just a reality, right? You have this kind of like, you have these edge effects, you've got droughts that are stressing out these forests, you've got fire. How do you manage that, right? You can't just say, oh, the 80% of the forest that's not cleared is doing fine. Like, you actually have to manage these systems to keep them functioning. We've held some workshops where we brought together forest managers at the state level and at the federal level to talk about, okay, what are their operational challenges about accounting for carbon emissions, like in those areas, or managing those forests, illegal invasions, et cetera. And the scientists who are trying to map this stuff and understand these processes and just kind of like try to figure out what are the technical challenges, what are the operational challenges, how do we move forward together. Just having that conversation led very recently to an opportunity to comment on the Brazilian legislation that was up for reevaluation. It's called the PPCD. So it's basically the, oh my gosh, the program for monitoring deforestation of the Amazon. It had never considered degradation before. And we had one of the people who was working on that legislation at our workshop, and he's like, it would really be helpful if all of this was communicated in the public comment period. You know, the degradation piece needs to be part of the monitoring and part of the enforcement and part of the national policy. And so we did that. We wrote a policy brief. We organized people to comment during the public comment period. And now they've added forest degradation into that piece of legislation for the first time. So it's kind of just being part of the conversation and being ready to provide the scientific data to, you know, to kind of support policymakers as they're making decisions. That was a long-winded answer, but
Thank you for those wonderful answers. And we'll stop here. Let's thank Dr. Macedo